Okay, welcome everybody. Just a couple of housekeeping matters first of all. Should the fire alarm go, then you need to leave immediately by the nearest exit. So I'm reliably told there is one exit behind the curtains there, very mysterious, and there is 3 exits behind you. And the other thing I just ask you to check is that your mobile phone is switched off, please. So, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, welcome to this, the 3rd lecture this year in the London Lecture Series. I am very pleased today to welcome Professor Euan Clarkson from the University of Edinburgh, who's a very distinguished colleague and very good friend of mine. And he's going to talk to us tonight on the Cambrian Alum Shales of Scandinavia and their remarkable trilobites. So my name's Angela Coe, and I'm at the Open University, and I specialise in sedimentology and stratigraphy, and occasionally venture a bit into paleontology. And what we want to entertain you with tonight is, in fact, 3 remarkable things. So the first remarkable thing is Professor Euan Clarkson himself. And I think Euan is remarkable for several reasons. First of all, he has an exceedingly good research record, mostly specialising in trilobites. He has published over 150 papers. And this all started, he graduated from Cambridge in 1960. He got his first lectureship at the University of Edinburgh in 1963, so just 3 years after graduating, which is very good. He did his PhD there in Cambridge. And he's spent his career actually in the University of Edinburgh, where he's been one of the main pillars of that department, having seen through hundreds of undergraduates and trained them, as well as, I'm sure, tens of postgraduate students. And Euan is remarkable in his style of teaching. He's a very caring teacher, a very insightful teacher. He always gives very freely of his time to everybody to ensure that they understand concepts, but also to understand the perspective that they're actually coming from. And not only has he done that with the undergraduates and the postgraduate students, but he's also freely given of his time to lots of different amateur societies as well. And I think this makes him really one of our most eminent geologists within the country. So, of course, it's also exemplified by his book on invertebrate paleontology, which was first published in 1969 and has gone through to 4 different editions and forms one of the main textbooks for almost all the undergraduates, both in this country and I'm sure elsewhere. Okay, so the second most remarkable thing that I want to talk about, start you off on, is the Alum Shales that Euan will be talking about tonight. And the Alum Shales in Scandinavia were deposited over 500 million years ago. And we know from their lithology, they are these organic-rich mud rocks, black shales, were probably deposited in deoxygenated oceans when the oxygen levels fell really low, representing some big environmental event. And it's their fine-grained nature and their richness in the organic matter which leads to the 3rd remarkable thing, and that is the faunas that they preserve, these trilobite faunas within them, which is what Euan will be showing you in a great many very lovely slides. So, I would like to welcome tonight Professor Euan Clarkson.
Well, thank you very much, Angela, for that extremely kind introduction. She's far too nice. That's the only thing that worries me about her. Okay, 500 million years ago. And I want you to envisage a level sea floor of the most revolting, stagnant, evil-smelling mud. I think it must have been evil smelling. It was full of sulfur. It was low in oxygen, as Angela said. And in places, I think we get drifting masses of rotting algal vegetation accumulating on the surface. Now, most people, most organisms wouldn't wish to live in such unpleasant conditions. But there were some marine invertebrates which were well adapted to it, and most particularly the trilobites belonging to an order Olenidae. And here, on the right-hand side, is a picture of one of these. Sorry, wrong one. There we are. It's a standard Cambrian trilobite in certain ways, but it has distinctive features which I won't go into. The important thing is that these were well adapted to this fairly hostile and unpleasant environment. Right, let's continue. Where do they occur? We do find some in central England, Nuneaton. We find some in Wales as well. But the heartland, if we can put it that way, is in Scandinavia. And most particularly the best successions are in southern Sweden, that part of Sweden known as Skåne, which forms the southern province. And they often occur in quite phenomenal numbers. Look at that. This is an example. These are Olenid trilobites, yes, but these actually come from Shropshire. But there's an awful lot of them, so I thought you'd like to see the picture. Right. Why do they occur in such numbers? It is very often the case that if you find, either in the fossil state or living animals, if you get a lot of them, very large numbers of them, belonging to only a very few species, then that is indicative, frequently, of a very stressed environment. The founder population gets into this environment, they're able to adapt to it somehow, and they then can proliferate enormously. But because it is a hostile environment, not everybody wants to live there. Nobody else, in fact. And so it is a good indicator of something. And in this case, it is dysoxia, a singular lack of oxygen. Well, I'm sorry to have to turn this slide off because it's so pretty, but we'll get on to some other things as well. Here is a geological map of southern Sweden, and it's interesting geology. There's all this stuff is Precambrian basement. There is Cretaceous and Tertiary here and here, and this is Jurassic, and here is a thin strip of Cambrian, Lower, Middle and Upper Cambrian. The Upper Cambrian is now known as the Furongian, and I'll come back to that term soon enough. And it is in here, in this Cambrian, that we get lots and lots of trilobites. Now, let's just look at the succession, and I'll start with this picture here of what the exposures are actually like. This is a long quarry, fully a kilometre long, at a place called Androrum. And it was, here, alum was extracted from 1636 to 1912. And the most recent part of the quarries are still comparatively well exposed. So what do we have here? Well, we have two things. We have, firstly, shales, and secondly, big lumps of calcium carbonate. These are concretions, and they have a part to play in this story. This is Professor Per Alberia from Lund University, and one of his colleagues, looking at these successions. I first went there about 30 years ago with the intention of collecting teaching material, and I got some and brought it back. But while I was in Lund, my kind friends there said, look, there's plenty of things to do. Would you like to join us in exploring this sort of thing? And most particularly, working out how these trilobites, adult trilobites, trilobites grow from the baby stages, and I'll come on to that. So I said yes, and I've been involved with this ever since. It's been tremendous fun. Right. Now, if you crack the concretions, the carbonate masses, then you will discover exquisitely preserved trilobites like these, and in great numbers. Well, you can imagine using the scanning electron microscope the amount of detail that can be seen in these. And there again, I want to develop that idea shortly. Great numbers of them. Well, these are, let me just go to this one. Those are the juvenile, not juvenile, adolescent stages, we can call them, of this. Parabolina is one of the many olenids that we see. It has nice spiny structure, head, eye, etc. All things you expect to see in a Cambrian trilobite. And you find the small stages in with it. There's the head of an adolescent. Go back to this slide. Here, it's not quite the same form as you can see. There it is again. And here is a real baby one that's a tiny head. And they are really exquisitely preserved. You can get trilobites in the shales as well. Sometimes they've been destroyed by diagenesis, but very often they're very nice, but they're flattened. They're squashed flat, so we don't see the beautiful preservation like this. Now, let's just find ourselves on the paleo map of Scandinavia, and that belonged to this continent, the Baltic continent. There is Scandinavia as it is. It has been rotated, but this continent was originally located in southern latitudes, and eventually it collided with the Laurentian continent, which is Scotland, North America, and the rest of it, and Avalonia, which is England, Wales, Newfoundland, etc., eastern Newfoundland. And this is where we are concentrating. Right. Now, just a few words about the succession. The Middle Cambrian fauna was very diverse, but the Upper Cambrian, or Furongian, was really restricted with usually only one and never more than 5 species at each level. And this is because of the dysoxic conditions which prevailed. But as I mentioned, the Olenids were adapted to these conditions and flourished in great numbers. Now, here's a chart which shows exactly this. It's an old chart, and but nevertheless, it actually shows what is happening. Lower Cambrian is mainly sandy. There are some trilobites in it, a few in the shaly bands, and that's it. Then there's a great burst of diversity in the Middle Cambrian, both amongst real trilobites like this and these agnostoids, which are not generally believed to be trilobites now, related in some way, but they have a completely different leg structure. Very interesting. And you see the diversity here. It's enormous, both these. This Middle Cambrian fauna is very extensive. It can be traced from Newfoundland through southern France, Spain, into Bohemia in the Czech Republic, and of course Scandinavia. And we do have it here as well in Wales. Well, it's a diverse fauna. And then something happens, associated, I'm sure, with the dysoxic conditions, because at the end of the Middle Cambrian, it disappears abruptly. And there is one level where we just get these agnostoids, one single species, and then the Olenids come in. And you see the limited, very, very limited diversity of these by comparison with a great burst of things in the Middle Cambrian. Moreover, the agnostoids virtually disappear. We do get in certain horizons a few brachiopods, testifying perhaps to an increase in oxygenation, at least for a time. Great. Well, let's continue. There are also barren intervals, although there's trilobites and such like all the way through. there are 4 or 5 barren intervals which correlate with other global events. Some may be due to total anoxia, where all the oxygen is switched off completely, so nothing can live. Others has been proposed by very detailed and very good geochemical studies, may be the result of remobilization of sulfates in the sediment and consequent dissolution of the fossils. So for that, there would need to be more oxygen than usual. And it's a bit of a problem in trying to distinguish between the 2 kinds of barren interval. Now, let's see what else. Now, here is a chart showing not all the Olenids. We'll see this again several times during the course of this talk. Here we have the Middle Cambrian, which I've just spoken about. Here we have the lower part of the Upper Cambrian or Furongian, and going up to the Traumatic, lower part of the Ordovician, and all the way through from this rootstock genus Olenid, we have various other Olenids developing, including one group known as the leptoplastines. There's leptoplastus zones here, with lots of spines. These are particularly interesting, and they contain some of the most interesting trilobites that we have in the Upper Cambrian of Scandinavia. They do continue to the end, and here's a funny looking one, and then go into the Ordovician based upon just a few survivors, but they go all the way through. So we're going to look at a number of these and find out what we can learn from them. Okay, the first thing, how do they grow from the baby stages onwards? Now, vertebrates grow by lengthening of bones and soft tissues, but arthropods inhabit a hard outer skeleton. And how can you grow if that is what you're encased in? Well, they had to grow by molting. And first they secrete a soft, wrinkled, flexible shell below the old one. And then, and that is one size larger than the existing one, then they break out of the old shell. And there are special lines of weakness on the trilobite head, enabling them to do that. They pump themselves up with water, the soft shell straightens out and thickens and hardens. But this is a hazardous process, and something like 80% of arthropod mortality takes place during molting. Not all arthropods grow this way. Consider butterflies, for example. They are caterpillars, first of all, so eating machines, and then they pupate and all the other things. But if you're a trilobite, well, you have problems. Here is a very sad ancient tragedy, because it shows a soft-shelled trilobite which has escaped from its old shell but died in the process. This is not an Olenid, it's a Devonian phacoppid from Ohio, USA. Let's have a look at it. Now, isn't that nice? There is the old shell here. That's the thorax and tail. There is the eye, so the rest of it is underneath here. And this is a soft-shelled trilobite. It's bigger than the other one, and the cuticle, or the exoskeleton, is extremely thin. So it died. Now, many of the small trilobites we find, babies, maybe molt stages. Some will be dead trilobites. But whatever the reason for their existence, they can be found in fine sediments. Sediments need to be fine. They then can be arranged in a gradational size series. So we find out the whole stages of development. Now here is a baby trilobite. It's known as a protaspis. This is from Parabolina, which is one of the ones we've seen already. And here we have what's going to become the head, this lot. Here we have what is going to become the tail, as a kind of furrow just beginning to develop, separating the head from the tail. But what about the thoracic segments in between? Well, they've got to come from somewhere, and they do, because they grow each mote normally at the front of the tail here. And then when they are mature at the mote, they are budded forwards. So you get a whole series of successive motes with the growth and budding of the thoracic segments to join the back of the head. It's the most marvelous way of growing, and it is constant in trilobites. They all grow this way. Well, how do we know this? Well, the very first person to work this out was this magnificent paleontologist, one of my ultimate heroes. And if I started to get enthusiastic about his history, we'd be here until 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. So I won't say very much, just that he was a French civil engineer. They didn't like him in France because he was a royalist, and this was early 19th century. He came to Edinburgh, and I have not been able to find out anything about his sojourn there, but I know he was there for 2 years. Then he was supervising the construction of a railway, a horse-drawn railway, in the area south of Prague, now known as the Barandin syncline after him. And one of the workmen brought him a strange-looking object. It was a fossil, a trilobite. And he became so inspired by this that, being an old bachelor of independent means, he lived in Prague for the rest of his life and produced 24 volumes, occupying this much space, on the fossils of Bohemia. Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. He didn't touch the Carboniferous ones. But that was really quite extraordinary. And he was the first person ever to discover how the trilobites grew. Now look at this. This is from his monograph of 1852. Just think of that, how long ago it was, and what a wonderful job he did. And he was able to show the stages various, a little protest with a round disc about 0.5 millimeter across. There's one with an early thoracic segment, and so it goes on like that until you get the full-grown one. And he was able to understand the whole process. Well, of course, there have been many, many studies since, but I always go back to that one, thinking, well, he worked it out, and he had the drawings made. He didn't make them himself, but he had a very good artist who engraved these on lithographic stone from Solnhofen in Germany, Jurassic stone. Don't worry, I like the Jurassic. Okay, now let's go back to this chart, which we have seen already. And we're going to introduce you to a few more of these. And as I say, the latter part of my talk is going to be on these delightfully spiny things. But let's have a look at not only the growth and development of this thing, but also the structures on the surface. Oh, no, sorry, I anticipate. Let me go back. My sorrows. Here we have Protopeltura. Here we have its descendant Peltura. They lose their genal spines, which are these. Why they did it, I do not know. But anyhow, there we are with Peltura. And here's a picture of some Protopelturas with a little spine here. But they're basically very, very similar. Now, let me just elaborate a little bit upon the actual process of growth. We don't have in this one the first few stages, but we do have from what's called the Raspid 2 onwards. And here is the tail, here are 2 thoracic segments which have been released from the front. It's beginning really to look like a trilobite now. Here we have a later stage. See the scale here. They are small at this stage. They've got 3 segments. Here we have 4 segments and 5th one forming at the front of the tail and pushed forward. Notice how also the anatomy changes in many ways. This head becomes longer in this case. Don't know why, but it does. And here are the adult stages of these same trilobites. This is represented, this is the lateral part of the head, is represented here. So this part has been taken off and laid on a flat surface. And these are the lines of weakness which enable the animal to get out of its the soft-shelled animal, to get out of the old shell, because there are prearranged lines of weakness, like turning off a postage stamp. So that is ontogeny of this delightful Peltura. Okay, we'll continue. Yes, this is what I was going to say. Here's Olenid. We've seen this one. And let's just look at some of the electron microscope pictures of the surface. There is an adolescent one. Look at the changes in sculpture from here to here. Look at this surface sculpture. Now, I don't know what it means. I've no idea. But it does change. It's possible to track all these different stages through from beginning to end. There is an eye. Look at the lenses here. And here's drawing just showing, it's not the best slide, I'm afraid, but it shows the surface sculpture as we've seen on these pictures. And an abrupt change for some reason from here to here. And the eye, it's still present, but there's a suture line below it and it disappears. Right, nearly finished with baby trilobites. But there's an important point here. In many Olenid genera, the successive growth stages are all of similar size, and they plot out in clusters on a graph. Simple. You see here the babies, and all these babies are very much in the same size category. Here we have width against length, and look at them. Now, once you get up here, you can't see the original clusters quite so clearly, but you can in the baby stages because natural variability takes over. But there are some where variability is great, is enormous, all the way through the whole ontogeny. Now, there are probably explanations. As I say here, neat clustering is not always the case. Different species, Parabolina, for example, both those from Europe and in Argentina, show remarkably unconstrained variability. There's obviously an interesting biological principle. We don't have time to go into that, but it is, I think, potentially quite interesting. Look at this. We've seen this picture before. This is Parabolina, and this is a highly variable trilobite. They're not all the same, and it's variable at every stage during ontogenetic development. There, for example, I think is the adolescent stages, and look at this. Here we have the tails of two individuals from the same population on the same bedding plane, but they do look remarkably different. So almost unconstrained variability in some species and not at all in others. One other thing, by the way, for some reason, we retain in this one, in this rather small specimen, the impressions of the cells which secreted the epidermal cells, which secreted the new exoskeleton. And they're here, but only on the glabella, only on this central part. Why? No idea. Anyhow, that's sad. Well, let's say, I don't want to say anything else about baby trilobites. It's one of my favorite topics, but I won't bore you with it anymore. But there's something interesting that you can do with these successions. And bed by bed collection through a shale sequence, if you have trilobites in it, it shows population fluctuations and local appearances and disappearances, sometimes small-scale evolution through time. Now, the leptoplastus zone in the middle, back to this diagram. This took me 5 weeks to do this, and it's really quite, took a long time. The originals of these, by the way, were drawn out to this sort of size and subsequently shrunk. And I showed it to my grandchildren one day, and they got fearfully excited because they'd like to match the pictures here with the originals. Got it right. Okay, here we are. Now, We're in this area. We're looking at these delightfully spiny, prickly things. And the zones in which they occur, leptoplaster zones, have quite a number of trilobites in it. Here, for example, is the population. These trilobites appear at different levels within an approximately 1 meter, 20 centimeter sequence. And they're all quite variable, as you can see. Many of them have these dramatically long spines, which is rare in trilobites. We don't get all that many, but we do get them here. And how do they occur? Well, I think this is quite interesting, because I know this is a messy slide in a way, because there's an awful lot of information on it. But never mind. We start with here, limestones, shales, parabolina spinulosa goes all the way through and through and through. Then there is an abrupt sedimentological change, and the shale is replaced by calcareous shale here. And we get a completely new trilobite coming in, and they're going that way. There is another shale sequence, and then here we are with another trilobite. And then a hiatus here for a little while, and then these come in, and you find 3, very occasionally 4 species going all the way through. And then that disappears, and it's replaced by this one. And the message here is that there's usually a sedimentological change when there is a new kind of trilobite coming in. I suspect that whether, I'm not saying that this is a sort of speciation event, but perhaps they went and buzzed off somewhere else and then came back again in a new form, having developed into a new species in some other place and then returned. A bit of a problem. But anyhow, there's been quite a number of these studies done, and they really are tremendous fun. Okay, now we're going to look at what I think are the most remarkable of all the olenid trilobites. These occur at Anderholm, but the best examples are found in central Sweden, Västergötland. Here's a map of the Cambrian exposures. Skåne, don't forget this is Lower, Middle and Upper Cambrian. Bornholm, I know that's Denmark, so never mind. But no, this is Sweden. Here we have Västergötland, which is this area. And on the top of Mount Kinnekulle, which is here, Carl Gustav Linnaeus, founder of taxonomy, used to stand and look out over the great lake of Vänern, and he thought it was the most beautiful spot in the whole of Sweden, and it is incredibly lovely. And I would have shown you it, but I lost my slide. Sorry about that. Anyhow, we'll go here. And there are some nice quarries. Here's one of them. Now, it's mainly limestone, mainly concretions, not very much shale. Why? Well, we are nearer to the shoreline. Many of the zones which we find so well developed in Skåne, southern Sweden, are actually missing. Here we have mainly limestones, and we have a lot of bands of sandy material. We're nearer to the shoreline, so we got a bit of a different environment. But there are plenty of lovely fossils here. Now, this marvelous gentleman with his trademark white hat, Jompe Algren, is a local geologist. And believe me, the amount of value which people like that have to the science is quite phenomenal. And he spent 30 or 40 years looking for trilobites. And he found a fauna of extraordinarily spiny leptoplastines. They are really quite amazing. Well, let's have a look at them. Here is the simplest of them. And this is the one, it has a name, Stenopyge angusta, and reconstructed in side view, as it is here, shows that the elongated spines are parallel with the body. Here's the eye, it's got very large eyes, and in order to produce a reconstruction like this, you need to make many, many drawings, accurate drawings, to find out exactly how the spines come off and this kind of thing. It takes a lot of time, but it's worth it. So I think this fellow was adapted for sitting on the seafloor. The gills and such like were up here, and there was plenty of space, stagnant mud at the bottom, and this was probably a bit more oxygenated up here. Okay, that's one. There they are. What about this? Some of you may know Adrian Rushton, formerly of the Geological Survey in Keyworth and Nottingham. And he now resides a lot of his time in the Natural History Museum, still involved with trilobites. So we call this one after him. And it's an interesting one, because here again, these enormously long spines, two tail spines, and then these lateral thoracic spines with swollen bases, and they have nice eyes as well. This is probably a recently molted one, where the animal has crawled out forwards and displaced the head, the cranium, central part of it, in the process. So here's the reconstruction. And I think the adult looked like that. Nice big eyes again. These interesting spines, these are younger stages. We don't have all of them, but we do have some. And then my favorite of all is this. It's this guy here, Scandinavia albergi, after my friend in Lund. Now this is an adolescent one, where there are these spines. But once it gets to the adult stage, then we get something dramatic. And that is these astonishing spines with long flanges here, but only on the first 4 segments. And then they are much more slender at the back, and that's part of it. I haven't illustrated the head here. Again, it's tipped to one side, so the creature has, when molting, has crawled out frontally. What are these spines for, and what does the actual creature look like? Well, here is a reconstruction of these Scandinavia albergi. And this is the most extreme morphology, I think, of any olenid. We have these flanges on the front spine, on the spines at the front. What were they for? Well, my good friend Richard Fortey, who would be known to some of you from the Natural History Museum, made a very good and very interesting suggestion. Many of the animals which live in stinking mud conditions actually make use of the sulfur bacteria within the sediment and feed on them. So chemoautotrophic symbionts, as he called them, and they were quite, they actually made use of what was available, and they fed on them. Well, very nice. Might it have been that on the lower edges of these remarkable flange spines, there were bacterial nurseries, all bacteria growing happily on the lower surfaces, and when it felt hungry, it just had to use its front legs to scrape them off and eat them. Well, that's my suggestion, not Richard. You'd be ashamed to think that, but it's just a possibility. We've got to find some function for these. Okay. So that's one of my favorite trilobites. So one other point, by the way, Per Alberia, a very dear Swedish friend, is a large gentleman, and I'm ashamed of my stomach, but his is right out here, and it looks not dissimilar. Here is another Leptoplastine, and it is tiny. This is Scandinavia Ceciliae, named out of my former research assistant. And that scale bar is 0.5 millimeter, and yet this is adult. So it's tiny. Now, there weren't very many Cambrian creatures which got into the plankton. There were some, of course, but this is, I think, amongst the earliest of the trilobites which did that. The eyes are a help in this respect. My colleague in Germany, Brigitte Skornemann, has worked upon the eyes of these things and found it was well adapted for strongly lit conditions, in other words, the upper waters of the sea. So a planktonic trilobite. here we have seen this one already, but it does no harm to see it again after discussions that we have had. And there is this is about the longinal spines lying horizontally under the body, and they're supported if resting on the seafloor. So the gills up here will be clear of the dysoxic mud. That seems to work. But you'll notice that in the reconstruction, it has nice eyes. And here are scanning micrographs of the eyes themselves. This golf ball of a thing here is one of these. The lenses are made of calcite, which seems an unlikely material for making an eye, because although it has the virtue of transparency, it would produce double images at different depths. However, not too much of a problem. Trilobites are very clever. The one axis in the crystallographic axis where there is no birefringence, the C-axis, is in this lens out here. And so any light coming down there is not going to be broken into two rays as it impinges on the surface, and here only marginally, and probably had some sort of pigment screens underneath to screen out the bad bits. So these were very clever. And something else you can do with these eyes. Look at this. Here is another trilobite, Mesotenopyge tumida, and it has big eyes as well. It occurs in the same beds as this one. They too occur together. These are very common, whereas this fellow is comparatively rare. And here are the baby stages. So it's a lovely creature. We don't know what the tail looks like because it's never preserved. It fell off or something happened, but never mind. These two are found together. Did they live together? This is where a study of the eye can help us. Here's a reconstruction of a very closely related one, Spherophthalmus. Don't worry about the details, it's just showing the angular range of vision here above and below. And here's the big fellow, Mesotenopyge tumida. There's his eye with a lot of relatively small lenses. It's possible to do simple calculations on the adaptation of the eye, provided that you know the diameter of the lens, D here, and the angular separation of adjacent lenses. Well, if you have you know the number and you have the curvature, you can easily work out this. And that gives you a value of the eye parameter, which is rho here, plotted against log luminance, and there's the eye parameter in radians. I don't know the mathematics, but nevertheless. Here we see diurnal insects adapted to daylight conditions with their compound eyes. Here we have creatures adapted to interior light, street light, and night. And there is our deep sea amphipods, which are adapted to really night conditions, but can pick up a lot of light because they have a high eye parameter. And here we have Spherophthalmus, this is one of ours, and here we have Mesotenopyge, and these plot out in different parts of the graph. And it seems as though they're adapted to different conditions. Well, I won't bore you with any more physics because I don't really understand myself, but never mind. We look at a few last and final things. What else was living in the Alum Shales sea? There were brachiopods at some levels, all belonging to one species, probably adapted for relatively low oxygen conditions, but possibly testifying to brief periods of ventilation. But we have these as well. These are crustaceans, and they are preserved as films of bacterial origin. These animals died, and directly after they died, bacteria spread over the surfaces, similar to plant bacteria upon one's teeth. The soft parts rotted away, the cuticle disappeared, but we were left with these extremely fragile shells which replicate the surface perfectly. Here are some others, and a great deal of excellent work has been done upon the relationships of these with living crustaceans. I remember these were discovered in 1975, I think it was, by Professor Klaus Müller of Bonn University in Germany. And I went to visit him some years later to have a look at these things. And he said, come into my lab. And there was the laboratory. There were 6 sharp-eyed young schoolgirls picking these things out. And he let them have 3/4 of an hour on this and didn't want them to strain their eyes. So then he sent them home. And there was standing in the doorway at the end, this benevolent old German professor handing out a little pay packet to each of these children. It was ever so sweet. It really was rather lovely. Okay. And there is a reconstruction of what the seafloor was possibly like. Yes, I painted it, but I'd be obliged if you don't laugh. What do we have here? We have these, you've seen them already, with big eyes. We have these creatures living probably on the upper surface of the mud. Here is the discarded exoskeleton of one of these spiny trilobites. And here's another one of the crustaceans. These are conodonts, voracious predators with big eyes and nasty teeth inside. So it was probably something not dissimilar to this. Okay, lastly, there are many nice successions in the world where you find olenids. But in northwest Argentina, there are, the most enchanting thing of all is that the rocks are exposed in ways which they never are here, and never are in Sweden either. It makes these glorious exposures. If you like cacti, they're here as well. But these sections yield trilobites and other fossils, often in great abundance. And here are my friends, Franco Tortello, this delightful man, and his colleague who's sedimentologist, Susana Esteban. And we were going to go and have a look at a trilobite exposure going along this road. And unfortunately, we found that as we got a little further along, the road had been carried away by a landslide. And so we never got to see our trilobites. Great pity. Oh, and yes, I meant to tell about this. Here is one of the trilobites we find in Argentina, but it was first described from there. But there's a global distribution, maybe in a pelagic form, actively swimming in the upper waters of the sea, large eyes with many lenses. And how do you pronounce it? I'm told it's something like Jujuyaspis, named after the province of Jujuy in Argentina. Last picture, a puzzle. This is one of the trilobites which Jonper found. It's a very beautiful one. Here we have the nice, long, typical leptoplastine spines, this extreme spinosity. And the spines come off at the same level. 1, 2, 3. And then they change direction. And look at this. It could collapse itself, looking like a miserable frog here, and sitting on the seafloor. But it could also raise its tail if it straightened out this, and these are accurate. And why did it do it? Well, I've no idea. I can't help feeling that nobody wants to eat such a prickly thing as this. Although, perhaps if it was descending itself, and something approached it from the rear, all it would have to do was flip the tail up and say, boo! That's it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Euan.
Thank you.
I'm Alan Lord. I'm the Secretary for Foreign and External Affairs of the Geological Society, and it's my pleasure and duty to close the meeting. But first, Euan is happy to receive some questions. So if anybody has a question, please put up your hand, and then Jess and Annie will bring a microphone to you, but please wait for the microphone. So gentleman here in the blue shirt. Jess, this gentleman here. Yeah, it's coming. Okay, thank you.
It's probably a very quick and easy question. I know with ammonites that there's quite a sexual dimorphism in terms of size. How do you identify male and female trilobites, or does that not?
This is an interesting one. Dimorphism. It's not very evident in trilobites, apart from, in some instances, Richard Forte described a sort of possible brood pouch in some of the Olenids with a bubble-like bulge on the head, and thought, well, it isn't found in all of them, only in some, possibly half the population. So it could be dimorphic, and it could be a brood chamber where the eggs or babies are kept for a while. But otherwise, there isn't really a great deal of dimorphism. No, that's a very good point. It would be much easier if that were the case, and I'd be delighted. Now, a point I might have mentioned is when they breed, what exactly do they do? Sometimes you find clusters of lots of trilobites, very large numbers of them together, and then in the surrounding same bedding plane, no trilobites. Have they come together and to molt and reproduce at the same time? Quite likely, because if something's going to eat them, and there are plenty of, not in the Cambrian, but later Ordovician, etc., there are plenty of cephalopods and predators, seeing a great bunch of molting trilobites, think, great, there's my dinner, and just home in and eat what they can. But if they've released their eggs and sperm into the water, even though they'd be eaten, the babies would survive. That's a possibility. So much we don't know, you know. It would be lovely to have a clearer perspective upon things like this, and ammonites as well. Ammonites and trilobites are the most iconic fossils, aren't they?
Yes, gentleman here.
It's a little extension to what this gentleman's just been talking about, really. With ammonites, there are features of the adult shell which indicate that it's an adult. Are there any similar features in trilobites that are specific and unique to the adult form?
Firstly, the adult number of segments. I think that is a critical thing, because they do. Most trilobites do have a defined number of segments in the adult, but you may find trilobites with the adult number of segments, which are tiny, tiny versions of the same thing. In other words, they are fully formed as adults, but they've got a long way to grow. And where exactly you draw the boundary, that's a bit of a problem.
Well, might they be the male ones?
Interesting point.
He needs time to think about that.
I need time to think about that, thank you. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Paul?
Is there any information about the appendages in these trilobites, Euan, and particularly this one that's sort of sitting up above the seabed like this? Could the appendages reach down as far as the seabed to move it along?
I would love to know that. There are appendages known in Olenids, in the Ordovician Triarthros, which is one of the later Olenids, and that was one of the first really good appendages, morphology, to be described. Now, there aren't very many trilobite genera in which the appendages are well known. There's about 10, I think. Derek might tell us. Yeah. But I wish we had more, and I would love to know about the appendages of these things and what they actually look like. The basic construction of trilobite legs is very similar. One pair for each segment, 3 usually in the head, and they consist of 2 branches, which have been traditionally interpreted as a walking leg, and a gill. And they're much Well, there's not a huge amount of variation in structure that has been discovered so far, but if only we had more, it would be lovely. It's a good point, Paul. I liked your question, but I wish I could give an answer.
Chris.
Just wondering about this hypothesis of chemoautotrophic symbionts. And
Yeah.
the reason I ask it is that the system only really works well where you have plenty of oxygen to combine with the reduced compound. So the animals which have chemoautotrophic symbionts now are those which have access to both. So it seems to me that the system's not going to work where you have conditions or environment where there is reduced oxygen, because in those sorts of environments today, you don't find animals with chemosymbionts.
Sure. Well, thank you for that point. I hope you can find Richard Forty and talk to him about it, because it was his idea. And I'm sure you've got a very good, and you've got a very, well, you know more about it than anybody else does, because you worked upon these things. But that is a very good point. I'll file that one away.
So, ladies, a lady at the back. Jess?
This is a layman's question. If you had a time machine so that you could go back and answer one question about your trilobites, what would it be?
That's nice, isn't it?
First question of the day.
Question of the day, yes. Good Lord, one question. I think it would concern what the legs were like in the baby stages. That's something we don't have any knowledge of at all. I'll dream about that tonight. You know, this is one of the marvelous things about having a very mixed audience. People often ask incredibly intelligent questions, which an old duffer like me has never thought about. So, thank you. Yes, okay.
Well, I think this seems like a high point to end the discussion. Food for everybody's thinking, and we go and have a drink in a moment. In thanking Euan, I should say that the Geological Society has initiated a series of years. This is the year of mud, which is rather appropriate because it's also the year of International Year of Soil. Next year, it's going to be the year of water. And we hope that the legacy of these years will follow on beyond the calendar year. As part of the Year of Mud, we have the Lyle meeting tomorrow, which focuses on particularly the exceptional preservation of fossils that we find in mud-grade rocks. And I think Euan's lecture tonight has set the ball rolling for the meeting tomorrow in a spectacular fashion. Now, with us in the room tonight, we have a number of the speakers for tomorrow's Lyle lecture. I did think of embarrassing them by identifying them, but I've decided perhaps not. But perhaps in the course of the reception that follows, you see people who are talking about mud and fossils in mud. Feel free to interrogate them because they're probably speakers for our meeting tomorrow. So, Euan, thank you very much indeed. Angela, thank you for introducing it, and thank you all for attending.